Okay, and welcome back to the third revision video where we're going to talk about business processes. So it's really important to understand what a process is. So a business process is an ongoing collection of related activities that create a product or service of value to the organization, its business partners, or its customers. So a process consists of three elements: inputs, resources, and outputs. What you want to know around processes is how can we make them more effective or more efficient, and they're not necessarily the same thing. So effective is making something better, efficient is making it quicker or cheaper. So in business process management, we're trying to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of our processes. And it's important that you understand the difference of them. It's also around business process management. We talk about business process improvement and business process re-engineering. One is an incremental process, where the other is quite radical. So if you were addressing a question around business processes, it will be quite important for you to be able to identify scenarios in which each one will be effective. So business process re-engineering might be necessary when faced with a radical threat to the future of the organization, whereas, if there was a little bit of pressure on revenue or cost, business process improvement might be an effective way of doing it. So here we see the difference between business process re-engineering and business process improvements. So you can see that there is a substantial difference between the two, and there are situations where one might be appropriate and the other wouldn't be. Again, if you were discussing this in a question, there would be an expectation that you would be able to provide examples of scenarios when each one would be appropriate. The reason why our processes are so important is the level of pressures that organizations find themselves under. So we need to be aware of what the sources of business pressure are from the environment, and also what the organization response to increased business pressure is, and specifically how IT can play a role in mounting that response. So it's all very well for you to talk about business pressure, environmental change, but you need to answer these questions on topics like this with the context of IT. So how can information technology help us? So here's a fairly useful mnemonic for remembering sources of pressure and environmental forces. The PESTEL framework, so it stands for political, economic, social, technical, environmental, and legal. So that's one way you can remember the sort of forces that are under an organization. So something like technology, for example. What are the technologies that facilitate people from working from home? Under environmental, it could be something like, the environmental pollution from disposing of batteries might have an impact on the reputation of your organization. So you should be able to identify the pressures that are coming from your environment and talk about how IT can help to mitigate against them. So economic things around globalization, increased connectivity from the internet has resulted in faster adoption of products. It's easier for large online retailers to steal your customers. They can also create greater customer power. So when we faced with increasing business pressures, we have to mount some kind of response. So in a minute we'll talk about some of the strategies that organizations can use for that. But here's an alternative way in which you can look at the different pressures. So this looks at the business environment, the economic environment, the social, political environment, the technology environment. So basically it's identifying the same forces, but again, what we see the pressures, and you might think how IT actually adds to those pressures and how IT can help alleviate them. So another thing that's quite important around the impact and use of IT is, to be able to think that it's not all bad. It's not a case of IT is making business harder or it's taking away jobs, that there are examples of how information technology can contribute to the social good. So while you won't be asked specifically about an individual case study in the exam, it is useful to be familiar with the case studies so you can provide good examples that support answers. So we talked about business pressures, and we talk about then, well, what can we actually do about it? So 3 things that are very important that you're aware of are Porter's competitive forces, or the 5 forces model, the value chain model, and strategies for competitive advantage. So each of these are useful in their own right. The competitive forces model allows us to assess the attractiveness of an industry. The value chain model is more internal to the organization. It looks at how the organization makes money, and it breaks down the activities of the organization into a number of different activities, both primary and secondary activities. So if you were addressing a question around the value chain model, you would be expected to identify IT, ways in which IT can actually help the value chain. So how does IT help us with our warehousing? How does it help us with our marketing? How does it help with our HR? And to be familiar with the value chain, and then show how IT can improve the value chain. If you were asked a question about the competitive forces model, you would show how IT changes the attractiveness of an industry. So it might raise the power of suppliers, it might reduce the power of customers, it might have a number of different impacts. And it's also to be aware of the different strategies that organizations have for competitive advantage and how IT can support them. So whether it's a cost leadership, a differentiation strategy, how does IT actually support that in the first place? Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this section, and we're going to come back then, and we're going to talk about ethics and privacy next.